Hi, and thanks for joining us for another edition of the Infrastructure Victoria podcast. I'm Steve Connors, and joining me today is Toby Brennan, the Managing Director of AlphaBeta Australia, and we're going to be talking about recycling and resource recovery in jurisdictions around the world. Toby, thanks for being here.
Steve, thanks so much for having me. It's great to chat about this topic.
Infrastructure Victoria has been asked to provide advice to the Victorian Government on recycling and resource recovery infrastructure. We worked very closely with AlphaBeta to understand this work. Toby, maybe you'd like to tell us a bit more about AlphaBeta and what you guys have done?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. We're a strategy and economics firm based in Australia and up in Southeast Asia. We've been working on waste and sustainability issues across the region and in Australia for the last 5 years or so. And we worked closely in this project with some colleagues from the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS and some of our network of experts over in Europe as well. So we were asked to kind of think about what does good look like around the world, and what are the lessons that Victoria can take from that process. And so we wanted to identify some best practice jurisdictions to focus on for our work. So we looked at a combination of performance, so what are the countries that have the highest recycling rates in municipal solid waste in particular, but we also selected case studies that we thought represented a diversity of different approaches to dealing with waste management recycling challenges. There's no one set of solutions. So we looked at Wales, the Netherlands, Germany, South Korea, and then we looked at 2 Australian jurisdictions as well, South Australia and New South Wales.
So we're going to talk about Wales, South Korea and South Australia this morning.
Great. Should we get stuck in with Wales?
Let's go for it.
Look, Wales is, I think, a really interesting one, and a great one because of its similarities to Victoria in many ways. It's got a population only slightly smaller than Victoria, a similar mix of a national or state level government with a range of local authorities, and relatively similar kind of industrial mix as well, which affects the design of the end markets and the use of recyclables. And it's a country that's really gone from strength to strength over the last 20 years. It's made itself one of the top 5 municipal solid waste recyclers in the world. So its share of waste going to landfill is now just around 10%, which is quite remarkable. And what's driven that, I think, is a set of targets that have moved over the last 15 to 20 years and which have been supported by a whole suite of different policies. So these recycling targets have gone up and up and up, and in fact over the last 10 or so years have been statutory targets. So local authorities that don't meet their recycling targets can be penalised as well. And that's driven a huge increase in Wales's recycling performance. I think there some other really interesting features, and you might know, Steve, from your visit there, is around how collection works in Wales, because that's an area where they've taken a really quite distinctive approach.
That's right. And so based on the work that you did, Toby, we decided we would take a closer look at what was happening in Wales. And so a couple of members of our project team travelled over there to talk to both local government and Welsh government about how the system works and to get a better understanding of what they're doing. It really is it's a non-statutory best practice guide for local councils and how they approach collecting household waste at curbside. In most instances, that involves a high degree of household sorting at the household level, much more source separation than currently occurs in Victoria. So one of the benefits of greater source separation is cleaner material streams and less contamination of material streams. And that's really important because when you've recycled a product, you put it in your bin and it goes off to what we would call a MRF, or a materials recovery facility. That needs to be sorted into its particular material streams, be it paper and card or plastic or metal. The less effort required to sort those materials means that it's cheaper to process, and so they are more able to compete with virgin or new product in the open market. And that's really important because if it costs a lot to use recycled material, that material really isn't valuable to the people that collect it, and so it's more likely to just get sent to landfill.
It's a really great example and a great contrast with the Victorian and in fact more broadly the Australian model, which has been the shift to commingled recycling over the last 10 or 15 years. Just one other aspect of the the Welsh model that I really liked, Steve, was that instead of mandating that all local authorities have to adopt this best practice guide, they've kind of worked with them one by one to encourage them and to demonstrate to each local authority the benefits. So it hasn't been a uniform implementation, it hasn't been a mandate from the Welsh Government, it's been a best practice process of working with local authorities, helping them fund the research that they need to undertake to adopt these practices. And there has been diversity, and different local authorities have innovated within that model.
So one of the key drivers of Wales's recently strong performance has been the high level of source separation. To do that, they often have to sort their waste into 6 separate streams.
But no, these are some quite clever systems that they've developed in Wales in order to enable greater source separation without increasing the footprint that people's bins take. So what they do is they use a system of stackable crates. So you have up to 3 crates that actually stack on top of each other and sit on a trolley with wheels, so it's very easy to move around. You can just wheel those 3 crates as one out to the front of the house for collection. And people might remember actually, the systems of crates for recycling is actually where we started with recycling in Australia 15 or 20 years ago, before we moved into commingled. So in some ways it's a bit of a back to the future idea, which is that more source separation can be done without masses of bins. And not only have they innovated in the crates, but they've innovated in trucks as well. So they have quite interesting trucks in Wales that have, up to 7 or 8 different receptacles within one truck, so that the waste can be collected at the same time. So you don't have 6 different trucks rolling down your street each morning to pick up the different waste streams as well. So they've really thought through the mechanics of how to make this source separation work better.
That's fascinating. We might jump from Wales to talk about South Korea. South Korea bubbled up from your analysis, Toby, for being a really high performer, particularly in organics recovery.
South Korea is a really impressive performer, similarly to Wales, where over the last 25 years become a real top tier recycler globally. But there's quite a different mindset there which drives a lot of their policies, and that is a kind of pay-as-you-throw model around waste. So in 1995, South Korea introduced volume-based waste fees for residual household waste. So that means householders have to buy a special bag and put their residual waste in that bag and leave it up for collection, and waste that's not in the special plastic bag won't be collected. So householders are literally purchasing each volume of residual waste that they want to have collected. And that policy has not been widely used globally, but it has been very effective in South Korea in reducing the amount of waste that's generated overall. So it has one of the lowest waste generation rates in the world, but also in improving recycling rates, because it creates a great incentive for householders to be putting their waste into a recycle bin rather than residual. And then in the 2000s, they started to apply those same methodologies and ideas to food waste. So they started with a complete ban on food waste going to landfill in the mid-2000s, and that was very effective. It was accompanied with neighbourhood food waste bins that you could put your food waste in. And then in 2013, they also started charging on a weight basis for use of those food waste bins. So not only are they forcing food waste out of the residual waste stream and creating different uses for it, but they're also now discouraging the generation of food waste by charging people to dispose of that food waste. So it's quite a clever and sophisticated set of policies. And the key thing that's also made that possible is the creation of downstream uses of that food waste. So once you've collected all the food waste, what are you going to do with it? And in Australia, we've got some composting. We're starting to experiment with some of the waste-to-energy technologies that can use food waste. But actually, one of the biggest uses in South Korea is animal feed, which is a use that we have not explored in Australia. And if you look globally at how even the best-performing recycling countries have done on waste avoidance is the hardest piece of the puzzle to get right. A lot of countries have got great recycling systems, great waste-to-energy systems, but very few of them have actually managed to kind of pull down the waste generation per capita line over time, because it does require relatively draconian policies, such as user pays, and making the cost of each bag of waste really transparent to the resident and making them feel it. But South Korea is a great example of how to do that if you've got the determination.
A lot of determination, and I suspect quite a cultural shift in our approach to dealing with waste as well.
Absolutely. I mean, huge compliance challenges around that South Korea has met. Obviously, there's a big risk that you get leakage out of the official or formal waste system as a result of these kind of pay-as-you-throw measures. So you do need a very strong compliance system and a compliance culture that sits around that to make it work.
A bit closer to home, I'm going to jump to South Australia. South Australia's focus has seemed to have been on getting cleaner streams by removing glass from their commingled recycling, and they've had policies in place for a long time to achieve that, namely a container deposit scheme. Toby, can you give our listeners a bit of a background on the CDS?
The CDS. South Australia was Australian leading, was world leading in implementing a container deposit scheme, which is we would call it a form of kind of extended producer responsibility, right? So where there's a cash incentive for consumers to return containers. So they first introduced that in 1977, which is that's remarkable. We're talking what's that, 50 years ago almost. And it's only now in the last 4 or 5 years that most other states and territories have made the decision to introduce container deposit systems of their own. So when South Australia was introducing this was really even before we had curbside recycling in most parts of Australia. But the benefit of a CDS is that it removes, in particular, glass from the commingled curbside recycling that we each have at home and that we stick out in front of our houses each fortnight, right? So it takes that glass out, and that glass, when it's commingled, when it breaks in the commingled recycling bin or in the truck, is a huge source of contamination for all the other high-value recyclables, the plastic, the paper, the metal. It's very hard to get broken glass out of that commingled recycling stream. So by taking the glass out through a container deposit system, it means that the other recyclables are also cleaner and tend to have higher value. So that's definitely been a critical policy in South Australia. But I think that the South Australian story is another one of a very long effort on this issue. They have had a very long strategy of being Australia's leader in recycling, both in developing the downstream industries, the secondary processing capacity, in setting aggressive targets, and they've succeeded, and they are clearly the best performing state or territory in Australia today.
That's an interesting point. It's a real signal of intent, isn't it, from the South Australian government that having had a CDS in place for so long, it reflects a desire to improve recovery over a very long period of time. And that's a really important lesson. Jurisdictions around the world are currently struggling to adjust to the new normal when it comes to recycling and resource recovery, with changes in what's happened in global markets, particularly China. And so governments everywhere are looking for a solution to a problem right now. But actually, one of the lessons we learned from all of these places we've been speaking about this morning is that it's the high-performing countries and states that we're talking about have been working on this for a long time, and none of them have just one lever that they're pulling to try and improve their resource recovery. They're pulling a number of levers over a long period of time, and they're making adjustments as they go to keep improving their performance.
I mean, all the jurisdictions we looked at, Steve, have been on a 15 to 25 year journey where they've had long-term commitment from government across that period. And as you say, they've adjusted policies and levers over time in response to experience. And you're right, we're all looking for quick fixes now after the impact of China's national soil policy on the ability to export waste from Australia. And there aren't quick fixes. These are big systems and complex systems that take time to change. So that long-term commitment from both government but also from the community as well to participate in the process is going to be so crucial to success. The other driver of success that I think is really important when you look across all these different countries is coordination and collaboration across the system. If you think about waste, it's never the responsibility of one level of government or the private sector or the community. It's always this very complex shared responsibility. You know, in Australia, we have 3 levels of government that are involved in waste and recycling policy. Plus, we have a private sector that plays a very significant role across the system. And we have the community whose participation is so critical to practices like source separation. So getting all those, and that's what makes waste and recycling such a tough problem, but getting all those participants in the system to collaborate and to communicate effectively is a real challenge. The countries that have succeeded have interventions along the waste value chain. So they have policies around waste avoidance, they have good policies and practices on collection, but they also have policies and interventions down the waste value chain. So around reprocessing of waste, you've got to get all the pieces moving together.
Well, thanks very much for that, Toby. There are some real lessons for Victoria there. A lot of the stuff we talked about today can be found on the Infrastructure Victoria website, along with our evidence-based report. You can keep up to date by following us on Twitter @InfraVic or visiting infrastructurevictoria.com.au and signing up to our newsletter. Toby, thanks very much for joining us.
Steve, thanks for having me.